If you're a viewer on my channel, or even just here because you're interested in mech games, you've probably heard of MechWarrior. It's Battletech's contribution to the gaming world, one that stretches all the way back to 1989. For many, it's the only exposure they've had to the greater franchise. Certainly, it isn't because there's anything wrong with the Battletech universe or tabletop gaming, but console and PC gaming has always been a more accessible medium available to all ages. Oh, and it's single player. Not all of us are so lucky as to have the sort of friends groups which would justify the investment. As of writing this video, it would cost nearly $50 just to start playing. Yet, since a good deal of the games have entered abandonware status over the years, it wouldn't cost a cent to experience the Battletech universe through MechWarrior. Of course, the MechWarrior franchise itself is an extremely confusing thing when taking into consideration the many name changes in early games, various console versions, spin-offs, and even a more recent game taking place in the same universe simply called Battletech. The original MechWarrior game itself isn't the actual first game featuring a MechWarrior. Battletech: The Crescent Hawk's Inception could actually be considered the first game in the series, since many of the MechWarrior games actually carry dual titles, instead using Battletech. Though it would be the original 1989 MechWarrior for MS-DOS which would establish the game's simulation style. Now, before I get into this game, I do know there has been a lot of controversy and legal issues throughout the history of Battletech. It's also gone through a good deal of redesigns, most of which made the game unrecognizable by the time its sequel was released in 1995. Even the Super Nintendo upgrade was almost completely a new game. Many viewers have let me in on the various problems that have plagued the Battletech and MechWarrior universe for some time now. I am, however, not an expert on these topics, and I don't like to focus on the drama and controversies that surround a lot of these companies. Instead, I'll be focusing strictly on MechWarrior and its Super Nintendo remake. If you'd like to elaborate on those situations, feel free to discuss them in the comments below. So without further ado, this is MechWarrior. MechWarrior was originally released in the year 1989, a whole year after I was birthed into existence. Home gaming had still been recovering from its turbulent Atari years, with Nintendo breathing life into it once again with the Famicom, aptly titled the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System?
Things weren't immediate, however, so a good deal of gaming was still delegated to home PCs, which, for some, were a smarter investment due to their utilitarian nature. A whole family could use a PC for reports, lists, bills, or pursuing hobbies such as writing or programming in QBasic. Meanwhile, systems such as the NES or Master System were still seen as kids' toys. Years later, MechWarrior would also see continued life on the Sharp X 680,000 and PC 98 in Japan. These versions would also use the name Battletech instead of MechWarrior. This would become a trend with Japanese MechWarrior games. I'm just speculating here, but this might have been due to Battletech realizing that the MechWarrior name was reaching a wider audience than its parent franchise. Choosing to use Battletech would more closely connect it to the tabletop game and possibly cross-promote. This could also be why MechWarrior 3050 was originally named Battletech on the Sega Genesis, only to later be renamed for its Super Nintendo port. And look, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the franchise and understand the connection, but until recently, I didn't even know that Battletech and MechWarrior were actually connected. It isn't even like I had no exposure to the series either. MechWarrior 2 and Mech Commander were major parts of my youth. I can almost guarantee that there were others just as much in the dark as I was. In 1989, MechWarrior was a massively successful game, making decent sales up until 1997, which is an insanely long lifespan for any game, even at the time. As I'm sure you are able to see by the footage on screen, the whole thing looks like complete garbage by today's standards. It definitely looked bad by 1997, but a lot of older systems were still out and about then. In fact, my family still had a 486 with Windows 3.1 in 1996, which I frequently used. More capable systems were still beyond the price point of many, making 3D gaming a continuing wonder until systems such as the PlayStation and N64 were more common in households. Challenging, difficult, and totally inaccessible games were more also viewed as obstacles to overcome, rather than being seen as disasters as we view them today. There was a better understanding of what a simulation was at the time. Cryptic systems, controls, and ungodly difficulty was pretty much the norm for something like MechWarrior. Though while the game might have been a 5 out of 5 for Dragon World at the time, by today's standards it'd probably be a 1, if that. While a lot of the game is certainly interesting with its freeform gameplay, faction system, and deeply involved controls, none of it holds up today. Rather quickly, the novelty wears off, as a multitude of unfriendly aspects come barreling at those who don't want to commit to mastering MechWarrior's every aspect. Personally, it is incredibly difficult to even begin this game. There is no real difficulty curve, as players start with a partially damaged Jenner and have to figure everything out themselves. Yes, there is a manual to detail the world and explain the controls. There is some entertainment reading about the conflicts taking place within the inner sphere and learning about the complicated actions that can be performed with your mech. However, it's all more interesting on paper. When the game actually begins, players will be presented with trial and error gameplay that, if skill and luck is not immediately applied, can result in a game-ending state. Most of this is due to the currency system, which almost every out-of-combat action is locked to. If you happen to run out of missions to do with a particular faction, you better hope you didn't repair your mech or refill your ammo to a point where travel is impossible. At that point, you might as well reload a save because you won't be able to do much of anything. This happens constantly, which really puts a damper on the core experience. It also means that you'll be grinding through the lowest level missions you can do because they'll be the easiest way to rack up funds in order to cover expenses. Cool, I get that MechWarrior really wanted to amp up the simulation aspect. It adds a bit of a touch of realism to put the player in a position where they're financially deadlocked. Yet, on the other hand, it ends up being extremely frustrating and unfun, especially since it happens so much. You can also get caught in a win lock, where the game simply loads a win screen and you get a bunch of funds for nothing. I couldn't tell if this was some sort of glitch, but it happened constantly. I would accept a contract only to immediately be given the win screen. It wasn't even uncommon. In my time with MechWarrior, it sometimes happened 3-4 missions in a row. This greatly extends the amount of time spent in menus, which is already just way too much. Gameplay itself isn't that great. As pioneering as MechWarrior likely was, it wasn't more than a good idea executed on software slower than a children's toy in 2023, though that also makes it impressive. Despite all of its complicated controls and possible actions, every encounter results in a head-on skirmish. It doesn't really matter what the objective actually is. You are nearly always placed in a position that has you and your allies facing enemies head-on. Every encounter boils down to outfiring the enemy, hoping that you don't put yourself in a position where you're left with a scrapped mech and no funds to fix it. There isn't an actual game over screen, so guess what? Yet another time where the player is put into an unwinnable state. Of course, I'm not going to sit here and say that the AI is too stupid or comment too heavily on the fact that it sometimes just walks away or in circles. This is a wickedly outdated game that lacks all the concessions of even the worst modern release, so it's what it is in that regard. Plenty will say that I'm judging this game by its wildly outdated graphics, but I'm really not. I'm not an easy picking sort of guy when it comes to checking out games for this channel. In fact, it'd be really easy for me to fill up my entire YouTube channel with outdated and dysfunctional crap, but I won't. I understand the time and the limitations of DOS-based computers. Like I said, I understand that the concept was likely pioneering at the time. No, it didn't look as good as something like A10 Tank Killer, which was released in the same year, but it brought the idea of mechs into the 3D plane, and I think that if this first entry in the series has owed anything, it is that. Now, there is an alternative of sorts. In 1993, the game was reimagined on the Super Nintendo, though that word isn't used by Beam Software or Activision, the game's new developers and publishers. It's intended to be more of an update, but it's almost completely a new game, for better or worse. Here, the story is a lot easier to understand because it's not as novelistic as the DOS original. You're after the Darkwing Lance, a cartel responsible for destroying your family. Through other characters and news reports, you can find a little bit more about the universe and what's going on. This feature was included in the original. In fact, it was pretty much used to establish that something was going on outside of all the menus and micromanagement. It gives a little more basis for your personal adventure through the Battletech universe, though it's not that great because the story is really just tacked on here. gameplay has been overhauled just as much as the game's graphics, as in completely. For instance, it's a lot simpler and easier to control. This is certainly due to the Super Nintendo's controller, which doesn't have near as much buttons as a keyboard. Don't worry though, if you're looking for that Battletech level of complication, it's still ever present in this version of MechWarrior. Every movement in action is affected by how your mech is equipped. Increased armor, heat sinks, a better engine, or more capable weapons, it all puts some form of stress on what you're piloting. For a Super Nintendo game, it's astonishing that this level of give or take customization is present. In fact, these options here outweigh some modern games, and most everything released on home consoles at the time. And in the Super Nintendo MechWarrior, there is such a thing as being both under-equipped and over-equipped. As you accumulate funds and build up your mech, power outages can arise, leaving you immobile. This basically means that you're going to be shredded to pieces while your HUD literally shuts down from overheating. Again, it's a nice simulation aspect. I won't say I hate it, because I love these little touches that allow you to really delve into the customization at hand, yet the gameplay itself fails to be anything more than an extremely fast-paced version of the same one-on-one skirmishes experienced in the original. Since the game uses Mode 7 to basically imitate actual 3D gameplay, enemies and projectiles are now replaced by 2D sprites. Visually, it's a bit more interesting strictly due to everything in the game now being far better utilized, making gameplay a whole lot faster as well, though I can't say that I find it better or worse than the DOS original. Both games are impressive for the hardware they were running on, though both can also be visually ugly. The Super Nintendo version has far more impressive arenas, but with the enemy mechs being 2D, they always feel as if they're on top of everything. The DOS version was able to achieve distance and scale to some degree, which did lend to an experience that feels a little less like something built on top of Mario Kart. I'm not saying that this game is, but that is honestly what it looks like at times. MechWarrior isn't a good game strictly due to modern improvements. Its Super Nintendo version is mostly forgettable due to being far less of an impressive technical feat in comparison to the original version. For the time, it was definitely mind-blowing. There is no doubt that it brought something new to the table. However, there are many reasons why gameplay in systems like this do not exist in this form anymore. Don't take this as me hating the series or anything, just as the basis in which I'll be judging the next entry. How much better did the series get with MechWarrior 2? Well, that's something we'll have to find out together in the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see that, along with a load of other sci-fi and mecha gaming content. I'm Kei-Nova, and this is me trying really hard to get a lot of subscribers. Thank you.